Good afternoon. Welcome to Conversations. My name's Emily Butler. I'm the Conversations Curator at Basel. We're really thrilled to be hosting two artists this afternoon, Colleen Smith and Christopher Myers, who both have beautiful installations downstairs in the Meridian section, which is curated by our moderator this afternoon, Magali Ariola. So we're really delighted that they will be in conversation, discussing past narratives and envisioning new stories in their practices. The conversation will last approximately 50 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes of questions at the end. We'll be passing a mic around, so feel free to put your hand up and we will get the mic to you. So please join me in giving our speakers a very warm round of applause today and enjoy the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome, Colleen and Christopher. So I thought that a good way to start today our conversation would be to speak about like your two works in Meridians, since the two of you are part of the sector, which I'm very happy about. And so, of course, I guess this is a great opportunity to discuss like many themes, since there are like so many overlaps like in both of your practices, in terms of, you know, like the different thematics and strategies that you might share, since you are both interested in, I guess, like storytelling and narratives, and you use like so many like references to like historical figures or mythological figures in your work. You have like a shared interest also, I would say, in music and performance. So maybe I know that both of you have prepared some images to share with us. So maybe we can start with you, Colleen, over there. If you can talk a little bit about your practice, and then we can switch to Christopher, and then we can start a conversation between all of us.
Sure. So in Meridians, what's there is called something I call a space station, which is basically building an environment in which a lot of different elements can be together, but is also very much designed for the inhabitants of a spectator, a person, to spend time inside of that space. This particular installation is really mapping very successful utopian initiatives over history. One being Black Shaker Colony, the first urban Shaker colony, the only urban Shaker colony in Philadelphia, started by a Black woman named Rebecca Cox Jackson. An ashram in Malibu started by Alice Coltrane. A desert museum of artwork that is free and accessible to all, built by the great Noah Purifoy, and also very much hinging on words written in the 70s by a group of Black women academics called the Combahee River Collective, who wrote a manifesto that was sort of a declaration about the ways in which Black women and their intellectual, cultural, and social work is so crucial to the sort of like liberation of all. And if we focus on building a world that actually serves and supports and enables Black women to thrive, then everybody else thrives as well, which is sort of like a kind of utopian ethic. How do you make a world in which everyone can thrive? It's not so much about a hierarchy, it's about what's possible. So that's what this work, the wallpaper is sort of a map of those sites. And then there's this nest of disco balls, which is an homage, a kind of like inverted autonomous zone, like from the ground up, like suggesting speculative powers and refraction, and then a video that sort of visits all of these different sites and reenacts this very crucial photograph that I found of the Watts Towers, which I forgot to mention actually, as another utopian site. A beautiful photograph of young Black men in the late 60s after Watts, posing at the Watts Towers, that I reenacted with a group of women in Noah Purifoy's site in the desert. And Noah was crucial to the Watts Towers being preserved and still standing today. So I think, you know me, I'll stop.
It's fine. And so we still have like a few more images, so we can probably, you know, like keep the conversation going as we see like all of this. But I think one of the interesting things in your practice is how, of course, you use like different media, such as, you know, like film, installation. You've also done like banners, like in your like very, you know, like the most recent show in Los Angeles. But I was like really curious. I think like film has like really a predominant role in your work. And so I think like one interesting point to discuss here would be, like how you actually kind of like reuse or recycle different works or different films into other installations, just like in this one.
Sure, sure.
So because you have like those, you have like Sojourner
and Pilgrim.
and
yeah.
exactly. So can you speak a little bit more about
Absolutely.
maybe those elements?
Yeah, the process I've arrived at with filmmaking is more like an accumulation of images where I film things or I create a situation or an event where I film something. But then this is just like an accumulation of materials, and the film is written through the editing. And that means that there can be this like, and also I can be filming in different medium, like 16 millimeter, 8 millimeter, red cam, 4K. And then this is just a big pile of like things that I'm thinking at, looking at, have decided to inhabit with a camera that then become a film. And that makes the images very promiscuous, that I use what I need to use to make the thing that I'm trying to make, that I'm trying to write while I'm editing, you know?
Great. And you've also used TikTok recently, I read.
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to find a way. TikTok is this amazing archive, basically, of like human activity. There are all these crazy volcano photographer people, like flying drones over volcanoes. This is something I would never do, but I am absolutely in love with the images. So I was trying to find a way to sort of like use this material without it being kind of like a full kind of theft, like a way to like use what the images they're making, but rematerialize it. So that, yeah.
Great. And I think like another topic that I wanted to address is the term opacity that you have used a lot in your work, specifically in relation to film. And this is like, I think like one of the first things that caught my attention is of course the fact that if you think about film, the first thing you think about is like light and transparency through projection. So it would be great to hear more about that, and also because it really like, you know, like rang a bell in my mind. It remembered me of Edouard Glissant's notion of opacity,
Absolutely.
which I think we could discuss later on, because you would correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like you've been also talking about the notion of authenticity, and I think there's like a kind of overlap in that sense, since Glissant like really was using that term, like the opacity as a way to counteract like Western thought and this drive towards separating things and making things categorizing them.
Yeah, definitely. I think like the film Sojourner, where I was talking about reenacting the photograph. So I gathered this group of women together, but then they were expecting to like act, and they kept wanting to like act and emote, and you do see that. But a lot of I felt like my job was to make them kind of inaccessible, so that we as the viewer can be with them, but we can't presume to know anything about them. We can't presume to be able to sort of like qualify or categorize or describe their experience or who they are. And that's really important as a filmmaker, because I've learned that there's a way in which people expect film, particularly images, moving images with Black people. They expect it to be sort of elucidatory, like I will watch this film and then I will somehow know about the Black condition. And that is that's the function of this film. That's why I'm watching it, so that I can have this information in my arsenal. And I find that means that there's no space for an interiority. There's no space for a kind of like inaccessible intimacy that all people are entitled to. You know what I mean? So I'm trying to make films where you can be with someone, but not necessarily think you know anything about them. So the narrative, in a weird way, is being really sublimated. Yeah.
And now that you mentioned that, I think the other like word that has come up a lot within your practice is like this notion of taking over space. And I think you also relate that in a way to film, and you've spoken about site and location as probably like the first or the most important factors in filmmaking.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this like notion of taking over space?
Yeah, like, I mean, the cliche is location, location, location. You know, in LA, it's like really all about finding the right place to make your scene, that the scene does like 80% of the work. And I got into filmmaking as an art director, so I'm very interested in the set and the site. The set, which then turned into the site for me. And, but then the way you're trained as a filmmaker is really, it's kind of like this militaristic colonial initiative where you choose your site and then you get permission to take it over. And in that taking over, you can do anything you want to it, or look at it any way you want, or access it any way you want, in ways that are actually have no relationship to the actual site, right? And this happens in movies all the time. So people who have never been to LA think they know LA because of the way that these sites are colonized and used over and over again. So I'm trying to find a different way to make a film so that I'm just sort of inside of it, and I have to access it based on the terms of the people who are already there, or the relationship, or what they allow. So if I need power, I have to ask someone in barter, may I plug this in? And what do you want in return? And these kinds of things. So that there becomes like this really strange social initiative just to make the image that's actually really depleting, but also it feels so much better than the kind of like militaristic overtaking, you know.
And so, could you talk a little bit about your current exhibition in LA, which is called La Caldera? I think you use the metaphor of the volcano there in a very interesting way, as a way of as a metaphor of overthrowing capitalism. And now that you're speaking about, colonizing space, and I wanted just to read two sentences that I pick up from there. Okay. The volcano obliterates all boundaries and collapses all orders. The volcano alchemizes everything in her wake.
Yes. Yes, so I think that's, you actually pinpointed exactly what it is about the volcano that became so interesting to me. I was looking for a solution to being kind of like descended from a people who are actually rendered landless, placeless, countryless in many respects, and that the volcano actually completely disregards borders, boundaries, nationalism, and it literally carpets over things that we think are important and has no regard. But then in so doing, actually makes new things, makes beautiful things. It's just that we're not around to see what it is. So I was looking for this way to sort of collapse and invert. It's like the grids and the boundaries and the borders that we think define us, and accept the kind of like a limitless generativity that's possible if we actually relate with what's around us.
Great. So maybe we can switch to you.
Okay.
So,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
go.
I don't know, maybe you can speak about the piece that is currently in Meridians, because I think there's also many overlaps in terms of what Colleen just said, in terms of thematics and interests.
There are 1,000 overlaps. You talk about, I mean, we've only really just met, but we like each other already, I think. All right, cool, just checking. The idea is that you talk about grids and borders. These are the epistemological, ontological tools of colonialism that have kind of crossed over our bodies. And, for example, this piece is a piece I did I was thinking, it's coming from all the autopsies that had been done of the names that we now know, and we know them because of their wounds. We know them because of the ways in which their bodies have been mapped. This is perhaps the first time that the state talks about these bodies, is precisely in these autopsies of young people who have been shot by police, Tamir Rice, and this kind of thing. And this theme of how do we break away from an intellectual kind of framework that is about mapping our bodies. You talked about the idea of the lack of interiority afforded to black bodies in film. That goes far back to early slave narratives, in which these are very mediated texts. These are texts that are to see the interiority of us, right? And I'm interested in both thinking through that intellectual legacy of borders and land and that way of thinking, and on the other hand, to propose and to resurrect some other ways of thinking. Of course, there are the theorists like the Paul Gilroys and Christina Sharps and folks thinking about water as a alternative, water thinking as an alternative to land thinking. There are people like Sun Ra, and this is a part of a series of quilts I've been making about films that I love. Space is the Place being kind of seminal in its right to opacity, right? In his absolute refusal to give himself a linear history, and that for me is the two sides of the coin. So this installation is very much about water thinking, right? It is how do you think outside of the land, the border, the deed, the surveyor's flag, all of these materials that have crisscrossed our bodies, you know, the insurance document, this sort of thing, and how do we think outside of that? A number of years back, I was in Papua New Guinea, and you see these maps that people make there, and they're maps not of land, but of the wave fronts. They're called meadow or rebeliths. And this is another way of mapping, an alternative way of thinking what it means to map. It's how do you map something that's constantly in motion? How do you map something that is not fixed? And how do we escape the fixity that is imposed upon our bodies? And that's all, that is what the work is about on both sides. It's thinking about the way that our bodies are mapped, the autopsies, but it's also thinking about how do we escape that map. Water is very much one of those things, but even the form of the shrine as a form, you know, this place is hard, right? We all know it. We've been walking through the hallways, all of the right angles of a convention center, all of the map of G4. It's like a big bingo game of art. Go to booth H17. But at the same time, there are moments in that to create a moment that escapes that or doesn't escape it, fails, either one is good. To think about, like, what does a shrine do here? How are shrines this, like, way of thinking the archive without bowing to the Western archive, right? How do you have an accumulation of objects that may or may not relate, or relate in associative ways? This is another film one based on Tukibuki, the Senegalese New Wave film that killed me in 1973. Did not kill me in 1973. I was not yet born, but you know what I'm saying. So these are the sides, the kind of playing field that I'm playing with, that I absolutely see you playing with. I'm excited to be on the same playing field as you.
And actually, like, just before we entered here, we were both talking about your hatred of archive. And I guess also, you know, like that kind of fluidity, like, that you're speaking about. Like, there's like three words that you use a lot, which are history, story, and mythology. So I would have like two questions for you. Like, can you just like elaborate on the difference between those three terms, and what is the role? Because I think there's like a very, you know, like, strong relationship to oral history. No, like this rejection of, you know, like the traditional way of framing history might relate to the fluidity of oral history. And what do you do with oral history in relation to the archive? You know, like as a way of historicizing, but probably not through the archive, but rather through, again, narration or storytelling, maybe.
Two things. One is I used to work as a history researcher. That was my first jobs. Spending time in libraries. My old friend Tai Lam Wong remembers me being in New York Public Library, like doing research as my first job. I worked for my dad, who was a writer. I worked for any other writers that he hired me out to. It was a child labor situation. It was sad, but it was beautiful. That being said, you realize that the archive, the record, the historical record, it has a desire. It pretends that it doesn't, but it has a purpose. It has desire. It is busy reading your body. And so that's the first thing to kind of understand, that archives are not neutral. They are absolutely tools, no less insidious than a surveyor's flag, no less insidious than the kind of a ship's manifest. And once you realize that, it allows you to invest in history as mythology, history as storytelling. And you realize that storytelling is never neutral, and that's exciting. That opens up the apocryphal, that opens up the mythological, that opens up magic, that opens up religion, all of these kind of stories. This is a tapestry that's at LACMA about Drexia, this apocryphal story that some of us who were thrown overboard founded our own civilizations. This is based on a playwright I love, Adrienne Kennedy. Funny House of a Negro is the name. And she's the kind of playwright that is overlooked precisely because she does not give that gift of elucidating the Black experience. No doubt when you see her plays, you think you know less about us than you did when you walked in. And that, for me, is where I'm coming from, is I love to be able to let go of the archive and open up that mythological Pandora's box. And it's an interesting path that you walk, because no matter what happens, people want to read onto your interiority. People still want to look and say, oh, I see what you're really talking about. And I challenge myself to kind of try to slip that noose as often as possible.
And so you've also used, and we've seen, like through all these images, we've also used like different media and, like different creative strategies. And I guess within all these, collaboration is very important in your work, and you've collaborated with different like artisans, guilds even, I would say. So, and I guess that probably is also tied into, like this kind of passing of knowledge. That would probably be something that we could relate to what you just said. So can you talk a little bit more about the way you work and how your practice develops in terms of collaboration?
Well, the first thing is that nothing is not a collaboration. That's when we're in this world, very little is not a collaboration. We have markets, we have these kind of Western things that are overlaid on us, but nothing is not a collaboration. And so my collaboration, I'm a lot more open, transparent about it. I work with stained glass window makers. This is a team of stained glass window makers in Guadalajara in Mexico. This is a set of stained glass windows based on the cells of Henrietta Lacks. And I'm in the microscope. I take photos of her cells. Her cells are known as HeLa cells. They're the kind of foundation of human cellular biology nowadays. This is cells taken from a Black woman in 1951 at Johns Hopkins University. They took her cells and then they put them in a petri dish, and they found remarkably that they survived and survived and survived. And they're the foundation of like everything from like the polio vaccine to current day vaccines. And so I thought of that a lot in terms of reliquary, in terms of how you take a little piece of a body of the prophet or a saint, and that becomes a healing thing. This Black woman's body from 1951 that still lives with us today. And in that science, there's a collaboration. And so this idea that anything is not collaborative, I loudly reject, and I loudly embrace you know, what it means to collaborate with theater directors like Kaneza Shaw in the back over there, or to collaborate with a team of sewers, older men in Luxor in Central Egypt, or stained glass window makers, or you know, an opera company. All of these collaborations are endemic to me and are central to the way I think. You know, you talk about, this is a portrait of a woman from Uganda in 1981, a woman named Alice Lakwena, who led the Lord's Resistance Army and was possessed by a number of spirits. And even that is a kind of collaboration, right? She's speaking with the voice of the Italian General Lakwena. She's speaking with the voice of an American GI named Wrong Element. And this is a way that I'm super fascinated in, like, models of possession, like spirit possession, and the way that in the churches that I've grown up around and seen, it's not a displacement, it's not a colonial model of displacement in which your soul is forced out and then somebody else's soul jumps in. You are ridden by the spirit, you know, that someone's you know, that this is a term that's used a lot in Haiti, and a lot of that you're ridden by the spirit, and that is part of this, like, it's a collaboration. It's always in a fluid term in that way, and so that's what I'm interested in.
And what about music? And you just mentioned theater, so that's also, like, very important, I guess. And it would be great to hear about, you know, like the influence. I'm not sure if influence, but, you know, like the importance of theater and mise en scène and music in both of your works, because I think you also use music all the time, Colleen.
Music. Well, I mean, backstage we were just talking about opera and how do visual artists work with sort of like time-based performative practices when we need time to make things, and then there's another practice. And then there's another practice in which you find it, what was the expression used, in the room?
In the room.
Yeah.
Theater people like to find things in the room.
Yeah, and that's terrifying. So
Horrible.
What does that mean?
it means that it happens it just happens as it happens in the moment. But we're supposed to be participating as people making, the frame or the set or the ground, I don't know how to do that in the moment. Do you?
I'm learning.
But I'm so jealous of musicians, though, because they can.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
so I'm actually always trying to make. Did I turn it off? I turned it off.
Okay.
As if I'm a musician, as if I'm in a band, and I'm always just trying to get my cinematographer. I'm just trying to get them to like play along all together. Like we're all anyway. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I think about music in terms of like a model, just like this aspiration of a way of making so that I can participate in all of these other mediums, but in a way that isn't so yeah, colonial and sort of like hierarchical and rigid. And inflexible, you know?
And I think also as African Americans, music is the one place in which there's been the most kind of discussion of our artistry and the structures of our artistry, like more than almost anything else, you know, that I feel like, be it, you'll take that back? No problem, it's all good.
Except that that's really deceptive because so many of those artists who are like deemed as geniuses were also writers, also visual artists.
Amen.
They had
Yeah.
like these like really multidimensional practices, but I guess like through the force of the market or whatever, music is the genius through which we're supposed to understand them. But I don't think they necessarily understood themselves in that way.
I mean, especially when you look at some of like the kind of polymath, like early guys.
Milford Graves is right over here.
Exactly, Milford Graves, but even, you know, James Reese Europe,
I mean,
or, you know,
the list goes.
yeah, the list goes on. I feel like that is an intellectual legacy that is talked about and written about in a certain kind of way that you can borrow from. And as you're saying, they too don't stick to, like us, don't stick necessarily to one form. And I think that that's that kind of formal, that formal boredom is not a thing that a lot of us are doing. I'm interested in that. I'd like, why there's so many kind of polymaths amongst the us,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, but also like it's also temporal too. So like I trained as a filmmaker, but working in kind of like a conceptual art frame. But through time, like you're still using these like modes of production in the same way. And I recognize that in musicians. Like I was just thinking about Herbie Hancock making that seminal record that like flipped hip hop, right?
Right.
And it's like this sort of temporal, like this thing of him coming out of bebop all the way into hip hop. And that's not an accident, actually. It's like his active practice of like applying what he knows to what is present, what is there.
And the way in which Herbie Hancock is an archive unto himself, right? And that I'm interested in that idea that when you hear Michel Ndegeocello use a moan as an element, that moan brings with it all types of history. That moan brings with it all of this kind of cultural weight that is as weighty as an archive, but doesn't have some of the limitations.
Candles.
Oh, so that was one of I'm interested in the last image was one of the kind of images when I talked to Magali about this piece, about the idea of what a shrine is and the ways that shrines are this vernacular commemoration, you know, that I believe in as a visual art form. And, you know, I mean, half the time, and I think this is true of your work too, we're trying to make art, but we're trying to make it not in, let's say, the net of art. You know, people try to, you know, you want to build something that lives, that could be as intelligible to my cousins as it is to everybody here. And so having a form like shrines, that's something that, you know, I had several of the folks who are working here tell me about their grandparents and their aunts and their uncles who have shrines, you know, or the shrines that I've, you know, seen in Vietnam and all around the world. Shrines are a thing. They're a form that sort of escapes some of the problematics. I'm interested in playing with that. Yeah.
Yeah, like just just appropriating forms that are used popularly, secularly, even religiously, like these forms that really actually organize people and bring them towards each other, but just using them in a different context to do the same thing. You know what I mean? But maybe without, like, I like a marching band, but maybe I don't like the military that comes behind it. I just like the marching band. And the marching band does everything I needed to do. Like, you know what I mean? Like that kind of thing.
And the marching band has history that you're bringing that, you know, like where the military is, you know, when you look at Morris Brown in the South or like all of those marching bands, they are letting go of some of that military history. There's a syncretic thing happening with that.
But actually, they're letting go of the military history and taking it all the way back to what it really was always, which was like the sort of like celebration of a life.
Yeah.
Like the masquerade, which was like the way you would see out your ancestors. So they're actually taking it back to that. And that's why they don't need it was appropriated. Like the procession was
Absolutely.
appropriated into a militaristic operation by like Napoleon and his ilk. But before that, it was all about ancestral celebration. And I feel like the HBCU marching bands, that's what they're doing.
Amen to that. And that's that presence of the archive that is, yeah, right? There's one of the earliest, like a piece I did a number of years ago was a funeral march that went from Saigon to New Orleans, because in Saigon they have these like jazz marching bands that start in the mornings.
Is that the one? It has
With
exactly the same title as the piece down there.
No,
It's
what's
a
the
different
title?
one?
The title. I mean, I've used that. I made a composition, a music composition, but it's called Echo in the Bones. I did it in a collaboration with the Propeller Group, a conceptual group from Saigon. I made a bunch of instruments and uniforms. I made a little marching band that went from Saigon to New Orleans. But it's exactly that, and they do it as a funeral procession there. And
That's what
it
always
is.
been.
It was funny. I went to talk to all those Vietnamese musicians, though, and I said, where are you getting this from? Because I was living in Vietnam for like 6 months. You start to miss black people after a while. And then you hear jazz in the mornings, and you're like, what's going on? And I would talk to these, and they're like, it's a funeral band. You're like, where you get this from? They're like, I don't know. Right. I mean, I see where they get it
People
from.
coming home
Yeah.
from Vietnam.
Yeah.
Bringing it back.
It's fascinating.
I
And
did not know that.
I will show you.
Yeah.
We got things.
Thank you.
Like just like listening to you, of course, there's like a whole spiritual dimension to it. No, like just like shrines and funerary marches. So, and Colleen, you've talked a lot about generosity, also like utopia and generosity in your work. So, how do you relate those?
I'm interested in what ideas around hospitality and generosity. Like, what does it mean to open your place, your space, your home, your land, your territory to others? Like, it's difficult. It's a very hard thing to do. It's also difficult to be the recipient of that gesture, and it's a push and pull. I'm interested in what happens if you radical hospitality would be like a full relinquishing of everything you have. Like when you say mi casa su casa, or if you say my home is your home and you mean it, what does that really mean and what really happens? And I'm interested in like testing that or thinking through that, like what does that really mean? And it feels like really uncomfortable and almost impossible, but a kind of impossibility that you want to keep kind of like trying to approach, you know?
There's also that thing that I think we've all heard or learned, that like poor people are so generous in this world. There's a way in which I stopped being a vegetarian at one point. I'm sorry. Precisely because I kept being in countries with people who were offering me their goat to eat. And I couldn't be that guy who was like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really just, You know I still don't eat a lot of meat, but there was this moment in which the way that generosity works is
It's
so
like
real.
difficult. It costs to be the host and it costs to be the guest. So you eat the goat.
Yeah, and I'm absolutely fascinated with that. In terms of the kind of collaboration in my life, the people that I work with, the artists that I work with, it's not a Xerox machine. You know, when I work with this team of like old men in Luxor, I don't just call them up and say, hey, Badr, you know, I need 14 of these by tomorrow. There is absolutely an economy of spirit that's at the center. And I believe in that economy of spirit, and it makes. I think that you see it in the work. I think that you see it in the glass. I think that you see it in the hand, and I believe in that economy of spirit. Yeah.
And I think, like, again, I would like to go back to, like one of those strategies that is very present in both of your works, which is performance. So how do you see that, Christopher? You've like addressed that sometimes in terms of, like, we're comparing like politics to theatralization, and how like all of this, you actually mentioned it before, like how all of this is like a way of just like putting things into categories also. So I don't know, I think it's also related to what you just said right now.
For me, I'm an old theory head. I'm very like semiotics. That's what I majored in, that kind of thing. And so when you think about performance and performativity, when you think about the ways that Judith Butler, for example, has been narrowed in the scope of their writing. I feel like I see performance all the time. There's performance that I get into when I'm speaking with Hannah and her Vitrales factory. And that performance, I think that as, when people talk about code switching as African Americans, that's all there's a performance politic that we're talking about. And I see it everywhere. This place is full of that performance politic, and it's both, and it's not terrifying to me. I'm not walking around wringing my hands about it. It's what life looks like. And I think that we engage well with that when we are conscious of it and we embrace it. There are those who like really study it, all the kind of theater folks, all you know, they really think about it. But I think that, you know, and in any time I've you know, you walk into this hall, and there's 5 kinds of interactions. There's the interaction to get your card. There's interaction with the brother or sister who is at the door. All of those are performances that we are engaging in, and to do it consciously and with love, dare I say, is what your goal is.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. So I was thinking, I went to film school, so I think of performance in this very technical, craft-oriented way, about the thing you have to land when you have to land it, and the skill and the craft that goes into producing that moment when you're using your body, your voice, your mind in real time in front of others to produce an idea that's bigger than yourself and bigger than the people. And that I always think of that as really difficult. And in film school, you do a lot of like drills with actors, like workshops, like to how do you get a performance, and how do you talk to an actor? How do you empathize with an actor? And I hate being photographed. So this was like always a real test for me, like also being in the scene, because once I had to act out a scene, I was like, this is the most humiliating and awful thing I've ever done. This is like the most vulnerable state of being a human. This is like walking down the street everywhere all the time and just being totally raw and totally open. And that's what it is to be an actor. So I think about that a lot in terms of performance and its actual power. So I kind of think of it as like a strategic thing. Like it's not something I unleash all the time, or it's not something I like want to demand or elicit all the time, because it's actually really, it's even as a filmmaker, putting people in front of my camera, I think of it as asking a lot for a performance. Sometimes I'm like, just sit there. I cast you because like you can literally just sit there. You know what I mean?
And you've never been in one of your films, then?
In anybody else's films?
No, in your films.
Oh yeah, I have. Like when actors don't show up. So I've been in several of my own films, or my own, like I have a whole film of basically selfies, because I had to photograph myself because I didn't have anybody else to work with. And it's awful. Like,
I so concur with that. Like, I can sit and talk to a group of people as myself. That's fine. But performance in that way, no. Like, I don't want to be on stage doing anything like,
yeah, I think of it as like a strategic, calibrated
Yeah, amen to that.
thing.
And what about banners? Like, I think you have like both of you work with that, you know, like element, but you have like very different approach to banners. I think, like, I think in your case it's probably much more like ceremonial, probably, and in your case, I think it's much more performative.
Yeah, like I am appropriating like what banners do to do another, like to shift it a little bit. And so they're confusing to look at because they look a little bit like Catholic, or they look a little bit like procession. They look a little bit like trade union. They look a little bit like grandma's quilt. But because I'm appropriating these sort of like textile languages that do something that I want to try and do, but also want to take somewhere else. Yeah.
For me, I was raised super Catholic. So everything does look kind of Catholic, I think, and might still be a kind of Catholic, you know, like, and it is for me. I started with talking about what am I appropriating, what am I thinking through. Asafo flags in Ghana are this form that, like, when I first saw as a narrative form, as a way of thinking textile, just blew my mind, and I wanted to play with that. And then slowly just got real big with it, because I thought, oh, you can, because I'm jealous of filmmakers, and I was like, oh, you can make a film up here. You know, if I do a 30-foot quilt, that's a film basically, you know, and that got me really excited. So there are all these. I'll tell you the other thing about the fabric work for me, that it doesn't hide itself. It's not mysterious in a certain kind of way. Like you see like a beautiful chiaroscuro painting, the question of like, how do you do that comes up. Every grandmother I know sees my work and goes, oh, that's hands, I see that, and I love that kind of like trick of accessibility in there. The way that if you have a bedspread, you know fabric. Everybody here knows fabric that I see because everybody's clothed, that kind of thing.
Great. Well, I don't know, I think it's about time to open the conversation. Maybe do you have questions? Should we pass a mic?
Hello. I'm sorry to contradict you, but it's very hard for me to hear about economy of the spirit. I know what you mean.
About?
Economy of the spirit.
Yes.
Okay, I know what you mean, but at the same time, it's paradoxically because anything that is related to the spirit, it doesn't have really limits when it's in the way to express the best. What I consider that is here in your work. So just think about that because it's very hard to listen to the economy of a spirit. I wanted to know more about the glass work that you do. How was the process? I'm sorry, I don't know about your background. So if you already did something strong at that point about it, how was the process? How you felt how you found the generosity of your spirit? Because it's what we can feel here. Everything but no economy of the spirit, but really the abundance of your spirit.
First of all, thank you for seeing that in it. For me, I grew up in churches. I grew up all the time with these storytelling like technologies, right? I wanted to engage with that and to kind of bring my own stories to the fore through this form. And so there's the process looks like an endless amount of drawing, an endless amount of asking people who have been cutting glass for their whole lives what will work and what will not work, and exchange in that way because, I can cut glass and I can sew. I do both well, but not with the alacrity and the skill of someone who's been doing it for 3 generations. And I acknowledge that, and I like that. I like to know that there's somebody out there, and this idea that someone should do something in a singular fashion is a very recent invention. I work with a bunch of puppet makers in Indonesia, and there you have one guy who cuts the leather, one guy who makes the mechanics and the sticks, one guy who paints the leather, and one guy who carves it. That's a generational practice on their part. So I like that kind of thing. So there are many, many discussions. There's many, WhatsApp is now my best friend. As well as I go there to Guadalajara and I look at samples of glass and pallets of glass. And even those pieces of glass are made in Italy and China and Germany, and by glass makers who are just making pallets of glass for stained glass window makers.
May I extend my question? Sorry. I remember when Chagall was making the Sainte-Chapelle. Sorry for my extension. When Chagall was working on the La Sainte-Chapelle, and it remembered me somehow in the moment that this type of practice was a revolution in what Chagall did. And I think about that when I see this, because you integrate the Black culture, then the African culture, then, and some other elements for people like Catholic background, as I have as well,
yes,
that break the structures, and it's impressive because there is a lot to do about it and integrate other elements that normally are not within the Catholic religion. So how do you feel the effect for yourself, and as a result, that to have some other elements that we don't see usually.
And first, thank you. Chagall's work in stained glass is absolutely a model. And I mean, I think that what we do is we are like amoeba. We pick up lots and lots of things, we put them together, we see what happens. I think there's nothing new under the sun, but the combinations can be original, and that's the gift.
This is a question for Colleen. I saw your film downstairs, Sojourn, and I'm wondering if you could help me understand the meaning of it. I had my own personal experience, but I think you might have something more to say about the meaning of that film. I'll share my experience, but could you explain the intent of Sojourn?
That film is trying to triangulate maybe many different historical instances of utopian initiatives, like moments where people tried to live differently than the way that like dominant social structures would have them do, in the interest of an experiment with how to live together, work together, who you could love, how you love, and what does that love manifest. And they're over, like the earliest quote in there is written in 1830 by a woman who was like describing her dreams. And the most recent quote is from 1977, a group of Black women intellectuals getting together to write a manifesto about their experience as Black women intellectuals. And all of them are talking about a kind of social care that I thought was really interesting.
I appreciate that's helpful. The
Sure.
location, the sites, where would they be?
Noah Purifoy's Desert Museum, which is outside of 29 Palms. Alice Coltrane's ashram, which was in Malibu, more or less, and it burned down in a fire, no longer exists. The Watts Towers in South Central LA, built by Simon Rodia, an Italian immigrant. And the Shaker Colony, just outside of Troy, New York, where the Black woman who was an evangelical spiritualist found what she thought was the truth in these people called the Shakers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure.
It made me think a little bit when I was in California, and I felt I was on a sojourn, and everywhere I was at was a temporary visit. it was a visitation site. I could be here, I could be there.
Oh,
it was
that's
always
interesting.
I was a visitor. I remember it was in La Jolla, and I was talking to a doctor, and he might have been living there for 10 years, and he's saying how he's enjoying, like it's a weekend visit maybe in my Miami Beach Resort, and he's vacationing there and he's been living there for 10 years, but it was like a sojourn, a temporary visit. That was my experience in California.
That's really interesting you're saying that, because as a Californian native, I think maybe that's a huge part of how I experience it myself. Kind of peripatetic, kind of constant movement.
Right, temporary nomad.
Yeah, which is definitely evident in the film.
I appreciate it. That's what evoked in me.
Anyone else? So maybe as you were speaking, Colleen, I just realized you were talking about like all these women writers. I realized that we haven't spoken about literature, which I think is also like something very present in both of your works. And both of you have actually worked around like book covers and integrated like all these, like writers. Can you speak about
Books
that?
and
both of you?
music and books. Yeah, I think for me, I think I have a really an urgency about like learning and kind of recognizing that there's someone who already has the words for something that I don't understand. Which is very much how I arrived at Glissant, which is really late, actually. I should have read him 10, 15 years ago, but only now is there a translation, I guess, that got to me. And then I was like, this is all the words I've been waiting for, So to me, that's the urgency of books.
I feel like in terms of Glissant, like I feel like there's this like criminal gap in terms of like Francophone like Black Theory, from César, Glissant, Maurice Condé, all of those folks. There's that gap has suffered us, I think, so much.
When you say gap, that means lack of translation of those
There's
works?
lack of translation,
like
but it's
late-
also not taught in universities to a certain extent. You mean you get Fanon, but that's 1954,
54.
right? And then even with that, there are so many. There's with the gap, aporia, lacuna, whatever you want to call, like this, the Combahee River Collective's manifesto, in and of itself, is something that I think should be studied more. As a way of thinking gender, it's really special. I think it's like the third point about the relationship to Black masculinity is a gift that is loudly forgotten. I feel like I'm super fascinated with that particular text, and this idea that the process of imperialism, the process of colonialism, the process of patriarchy is a process of forgetting, of imposing forgetting on people. That's what it does, and for us, I think I'm very much about the process of remembering, and that remembering doesn't look like the archive, because the archive can easily be a tool of forgetting, right? But it looks like these kind of practices of making work, making art. It's generative. Remembering is always generative. It's not about callback. It's about building something now and new.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful way to put it.
Great. So if there's like no more words, I think this is a great place to end. Like remembering rather than forgetting, and rather than erasing. So thank you both. This was
Thank you.
Smiley.